All the Lovers in the Night. Mieko Kawakami is what I would call my joint favourite Japanese author alongside Sayaka Murata. I find it very, very difficult to choose a favourite, so they share the top spot. And we have been incredibly lucky over the last few years to consistently get a new Mieko Kawakami novel in translation by the same translation team, published by the same publishing house, once a year, every year, at the same time of year, over and over again. We had Breasts and Eggs, then Heaven, and now this, translated by Sam Bett and David Boyd, who over and over again do an incredible job at translating her works. I will say up front that I think Breasts and Eggs is still my favourite Mieko Kawakami novel, but all of her books are incredibly unique. They have a very clear thing that they want to say, even if it's not always clear to you as a reader. And I think that was especially poignant here with this. When I read Breasts and Eggs, I understood what it was saying, and it was saying a few different things about female autonomy. When I read Heaven, I understood what it was saying about bullying and the kind of logic and morality of it. But I always know that there are probably things that I'm missing, and I think that that makes reviewing this particularly difficult because I would argue that this is the most nuanced of her books that I've read so far. Because at first it doesn't seem to be about anything at all, and by the end it so obviously is, that it has given me so much to dwell on, to the point that I really am considering just going back to the beginning and reading it again with fresh eyes. Not to say that there's any particular twist at the end that reframes the narrative. Kawakami doesn't do that. Her books are not genre fiction. They are intense literary character studies and social studies. So what's it about? All the Lovers in the Night tells the story of a woman in her early 30s named Fuyuko. Fuyuko worked for a publishing house, and her main job at that publishing house was just to proofread manuscripts over and over again to make sure not a single mistake remained by the time it went to publication. Now she does that freelance. She was kind of convinced that that would be an ideal career move for her, that she could make just as much, if not more money, freelancing at the work that she already does, and then she could also just do it from home and live her life kind of the way that she wants to. So she does. Fuyuko, however, is a very, very solitary woman. She's very insecure, she's pretty unhappy, but she just kind of exists in that unhappiness. She doesn't do anything to change it, and she doesn't seem to want to either, at least at first. And there's something I want to say about her with that in mind. At the beginning of the book, I wondered, much like I did when I read Sayaka Murata's Convenience Store Woman, if Fuyuko is in fact autistic coded. I wondered if she is intentionally being written to seem as though she's on the autistic spectrum, and I really don't know where I fall on this now, having read the entire book. It's quite interesting, but it sprung to mind. As a person who is neurodiverse, I couldn't help but feel something in Fuyuko's behaviour at the beginning of the novel, but the way that it goes on kind of pushed that back out of my mind again. So maybe just, if you read it, think about that and draw your own conclusion, because it would make for a more interesting discussion about the book if other people read it that way as well. At the beginning of the book, Fuyuko is very much defined by her pretty boring job and her relationship to one woman, one colleague who provides her with all of her work and eventually also provides her with her only real social life. That woman's name is Hijiri, and they are exactly the same age. Hijiri is a very different kind of person to Fuyuko. She is outgoing, she is kind of a specific archetype of a certain type of feminism that a lot of us don't really get on board with. She's a woman who is very performative in her personal and professional life. She's a woman with a lot of opinions and a lot to say about other women. And when I say that she represents a certain unlikable type of feminism, it's because that she has an idea of what a woman should be, what a woman can do, etc., but spends so much of her time tearing down other women, which is remarkably unfeminist. And so she's probably the most interesting character in this story, I would argue, and she remains all the way through the novel, playing slightly different roles, evolving slightly as the book goes on, and her relationship to Fuyuko very much changes as Fuyuko changes as well. By the way, I will have to kind of spoil a few things that happen towards, say, the midpoint of the book, just to give a little bit more context and a little bit more of a talking point. One of those things is the fact that Fuyuko just doesn't go out. She doesn't leave her apartment. You learn this right at the beginning. She gets her manuscripts, she proofreads them, she sends them off, and she talks early on about the fact that she doesn't do anything in terms of hobbies, interests, social life, friends, nothing. At the beginning, she talks about how she can't even remember, looking back now, she can't remember how she spent those dead hours between finishing work and going to sleep, other than eating. She doesn't know how she spent any non-work, non-sleep time. But towards the midpoint, Hijiri is managing to convince Fuyuko to go out, to go to a bar, to drink alcohol. And Fuyuko reveals that she's never been a drinker. She had like a sip of beer at college and didn't like it, and that was it. But she soon kind of not develops a liking for beer and sake, but chooses or even forces herself to enjoy these things because she feels like she's supposed to. And that's kind of the thematic crux of this book, is it's about performing in the world, performing professionally and socially. And it often reminded me of, as I've already mentioned, Sayaka Murata's Convenience Store Woman, which is one of my favorite novels ever. But that book was very much about a person performing in society. And I don't think that Keiko, is that her name? I think it's Keiko. I don't think she had to be a woman. And that's why in the Japanese title of Convenience Store Woman, it's actually Convenience Store Human, because that doesn't work in English, but she didn't have to be a woman. In this, she does. It is very much about womanhood. But it's very similar to Convenience Store Woman in the sense that it is about performing and trying to figure out how you're supposed to exist in society. Fuyuko is quite a blank slate, but she very quickly gives in to drinking too much, socializing too much or too little. She's unable to balance things and figure out how she is supposed to exist, and I keep saying perform because that's how it feels. And this is also why I found her to be kind of autistic coded, because she's not understanding social cues and social conventions. But Fuyuko eventually meets a man. This is in the blurb, it's not spoiling anything. She meets a man who is almost twice her age and seems like a really, really decent guy. And the two of them meet by accident when Fuyuko is at this kind of like community college thing where she's thinking about taking up some kind of a class in her spare time. And there are classes on everything. She says at one point that she spends hours leafing through just the booklet with all of the courses and professor names all listed down. And you can literally study anything you could imagine here. And she's umming and ahhing over what to do, and eventually she just throws up. She runs to the toilet and she throws up, and it's a very graphic scene. And then she bumps into this guy. His name is Mitsutsuka, and he is like in his late 50s, and he tells her that he is a physics teacher, and the two of them have coffee and talk about various things. He tells her about physics, and he tells her about some of his favorite classical pieces. He really likes Chopin, and she says that she knows nothing about anything, nothing about physics, nothing about music, and so she's interested to just learn these things from him. And that's what I mean about her being a blank slate. She has no interests, she has no passions, but she is trying to figure out how she can have these things because that's what people have. And the fact that she's got this man to kind of instill and inject these things into her makes it very important that she is a woman. And the fact that she also has Hijiri on the other side telling her, you need to be a girl boss, you need to drink, you need to do these things. And as the book goes on in the second half, she even takes some clothes from Hijiri. Hijiri basically is now dressing Fuyuko as well. And there are a lot of moments throughout the book where Fuyuko is meeting other women who are kind of clashing and bad-mouthing each other and gossiping about each other. And Fuyuko is getting a lot of kind of mixed messages about people and their roles and their place in society, professionally, personally, socially, whatever. This is a book about what society pressurizes women into doing and being, and how women should exist, and how women must simply figure out how to navigate that minefield. And what ends up happening a lot of the time is that they become aggressive, especially towards one another. There is a battle between women that has been orchestrated by patriarchy. And that's kind of what this book seems to be discussing, without any real conclusion, I don't think, because how are you supposed to have one? There is one scene in the book that I should mention that is particularly upsetting. If you've read Mieko Kawakami's Heaven, then you know that that book is just full of very, very difficult scenes. It's about high school bullying, and there are some really, really traumatic scenes. Some just physical abuse, others at least hinting at sexual abuse, and this one has one particular chapter that flashes back to her early life that is not pleasant. So I'm going to leave that here just to warn you. There is one chapter that is difficult to read, but I would argue that Heaven is a book that pretty much just abuses the reader from beginning to end. It's not an easy book to read. Apart from that one scene, All the Lovers in the Night is a lot easier to digest. I also, this is petty, but I just want to mention the blurb. I don't know who wrote this, and I know a few people at Picador and I like them, and so I don't want to offend anyone, but the blurb for at least the Picador publication of this really turned me off from wanting to read it. It's very clumsily written, and it just basically says the word light 100 times. I really didn't like it, and it kind of sullied my expectations of the novel. But also, this is a really, really difficult book to blurb, because at the beginning it is incredibly boring. And you're just kind of riding through this woman's life as you're getting to know her, but there isn't much to know. And then you're following her build a new version of herself over time, a version that she feels like she's supposed to be. So it's really tough to blurb this book, and I don't envy the person who had to do it, but I also didn't like the blurb that it has. And the reason I bring that up is because the blurb, as I said, mentions light a lot. One of the defining factors of Fuyuko is the fact that she likes light. She likes taking walks in the city at night, but she only does that like once a year when the Christmas lights come out, which also happens to be her birthday, and she likes just looking at lights. And it's a thing that the blurb has focused on, but I have to admit, it's a thing I didn't quite understand. I didn't get the thematic relevance of this motif of light over and over again. And when she meets Mitsutsuka, he talks about light as well, because he's a physicist. I didn't really get that bit. But if you read this book and you want to come into the comments and tell me what your interpretation of this leitmotif actually is, then please do. Overall, All the Lovers in the Night is a wonderful piece of fiction. It hits very, very hard. And as I've already said, it's a book that explores what a woman's place in society is supposed to be when she herself doesn't know why or how. And it's about the way that patriarchy turns women against one another and against themselves and makes them just miserable as all fuck. So it's not pleasant. But it also kind of is, because as you follow Fuyuko through her life and through her days, she's a very pleasant character to follow, even as she is losing her grip on herself, trying to gain a grip on a new version of herself, failing to do that, and all the while not really feeling much, because she just can't. And who could blame her? I don't know if this was a good review. I feel like I ranted and raved and rambled a lot. Subscribe for books.